What is up, everybody? Welcome back to another video. In today's video, we are back with another playoff scenario video for the Detroit Lions. I say another, but we did forget to do this type of video last week. I think we maybe have talked about the playoff picture a little bit, but we did not do a video last week. 2 weeks ago, we did it in the live stream. I think I just forgot to do it last week, but that's fine. We're here now. We have results from this past weekend's game, and we can update how the Lions can make it into the playoffs. Now, today, we're going to be focused on two things. One thing is just clinching a playoff berth. The other would be the divisional race, because both of those results, of course, are updated. We're not going to really go through getting the #1 seed in today's video. We can do that, but I would like to see the Lions get a dub first, and then we can kind of dive back into that, because right now we're going to need some things to now also shake our way in terms of other teams losing more so than before. We already needed to end up with a better record essentially than San Fran for that to happen, and now that we've lost to Chicago and San Fran handled business, they only have 10 wins, but for us to finish with a better record, it's going to be very difficult. They have one tough game left on Christmas. They play Baltimore, but outside of that, we're going to need some things to shake our way. So today we're going to focus on clinching a playoff berth and also winning the division. Now, with this is not something that I necessarily looked up and just like put it in here. This is something that I just kind of worked through on my own in terms of I went through the tiebreakers. I try to do some math with some of this stuff. So if any of this is wrong, I apologize. I don't believe any of this is wrong. I think this is correct. It looks right. It makes sense to me. The simulator was like, yeah, this makes sense. So this is what we have, okay? This should be right. We should be good to go here. Weekend's results, we had Minnesota getting a win over the Raiders, which, you know, they handle business. I say handle business. I mean, it was 3-0. I haven't actually watched the game yet, so I need to go back and watch that for tomorrow's prediction show. But, you know, 3-0. I mean, look, they won. I guess that's what mattered. They're at 7-6 now. And Green Bay lost to the Giants. That was beautiful. That was beautiful. But I thought the Giants sold so bad when Saquon Barkley fumbled. I was like, no way they're about to lose this football game. I mean, the game seemed over. Then all of a sudden he fumbles on his own. I'm like, what is happening? But they got it done with Tommy DeVito. That was actually one of the picks that I had right this week. I mean, I didn't have a lot of great reasons to pick the Giants, but I had a feeling that the Packers were going to fall back to earth, and they did. They lost to the Giants. It was great to see, and it helped us for sure. So let's start here with, can the Detroit Lions clinch a playoff spot this weekend? Okay, that's what I wanted to focus on specifically in this video is, after this weekend, what are we looking like in these races depending on what goes down for this weekend slate of games? So the question is, how can the Lions clinch just a playoff berth? We just saw the San Francisco 49ers do it this past week after this weekend, and I believe there is a recipe for it to happen. Maybe it's not super likely, but there is a recipe. Now, we're not that far off, but it could happen this weekend, I believe, if I did this correctly. Now, these are really the teams, you can see, these are the teams that we're really focused on here. I put the remaining schedules and also their records. Seattle 6-7, Rams 6-7. I did not include teams like Atlanta who are 6-7 because we have the tiebreaker, so at best they can get to 10-7. And in this scenario, we're talking about if the Lions beat Denver, they'd be 10-4. So because of that, even if Atlanta won out, as long as we win this weekend, we have the tiebreaker, we'd be fine over Atlanta. Same thing with New Orleans. Same thing with Tampa Bay. And then you get to a team like the Giants who already have 8 losses. And of course, if we win, they can't catch us record-wise. So these are really the only teams to focus on if we handle business against Denver. If we don't, we'll have to revisit this again. But if we do, those are really the only teams that we need to focus on here. Now, there's a couple things. First off, with Seattle, as we know, we lost to Seattle straight up. We lost that game, so they currently have the head-to-head tiebreaker, which means that specifically for that, we need to finish with a better record than Seattle. Here's the positive. Seattle has Philly this weekend. Now, they have them at home, but they have Philly coming off of back-to-back losses and losing to Dallas and wanting to stay in this divisional race. You would think that this is the kind of game that they got to have, and I think they're going to be favored in this game, though they're on the road in Seattle. That's not an easy place to play. If they lose, though, if they lose to Philadelphia, because if you look at the remaining schedule, they could win the other 3. They could beat Tennessee. They could absolutely beat Pittsburgh. They could absolutely beat Arizona. So that's not to say that, like, man, if they win this weekend, we might not make the playoffs. No, we just need to then handle business beyond 1 week. However, if they did lose this week, plus we win, now we'd stay in front of Seattle, because Seattle, best they could do is 9-8. At worst, we'd be 10-7. Then you move to the LA Rams. What's tricky about them is that they would actually have the NFC record advantage over us if the worst case scenario happened. Meaning, if we won this weekend, we were 10-4, but we went out and lost every game afterwards. We lost our last 3, Minnesota twice and Dallas. That would all affect our record within the conference. And currently we are 6-3, which means that we would fall to 6-6 in the NFC. If the LA Rams won their final 4 games, Washington, New Orleans, at Giants, at San Fran, that at San Fran won, I would think they would lose that football game, but they could be in a spot to make the playoffs. And then the question is San Fran playing for the 1 seed? It's part of the reason it's not a bad thing that San Fran beat Seattle. I mean, it might not be a great thing for the divisional race, but them beating Seattle puts it in a situation where they want to win the 1 seed. Kyle Shanahan's already talked about that. They want to make that happen. And number 2, again, it pushes Seattle down another game, so makes this a real possibility. So this, specifically the LA Rams, what they could have the advantage over us in is that NFC record, because currently the LA Rams are 4-4 within the NFC, and at best, of course, they get to 8-4. You look at those remaining games: Washington NFC, Saints NFC, Giants NFC. So if they won 3 of those 4, they'd have a better NFC record if we lost out and just beat Denver. But on top of that, they would have to win out to make this thing actually work. So LA Rams are the other team. That's probably the most unlikely situation. I could absolutely see Philadelphia beating Seattle, but the Rams losing to the Commanders this weekend at home, I don't think it's going to happen, but it could. It could. And here's the thing. It's like, look, earlier this year, I was like, man, I really like Washington. They've looked pretty awful since then. They're not good. But with that being said, if they can handle business, all of a sudden they fall to 6-8. Now you kind of just get rid of that NFC conference record or any potential of them passing us. Again, they're not passing us right now. We're 6-3. They're 4-4. But now that goes out the window, because at best they can get to 9-8. At worst, we'd be at 10-7 with a win. So now we pass LA. And then, of course, it's the other teams. Now, here's what needs to be focused on is how many teams are let into the playoffs. Now that we let 3 wildcard teams in from each conference, we're looking at a situation where that 5th seed would likely go to either Dallas or Philly. One of those 2 teams are getting it, and someone could get it with like 14 wins, okay? One of those teams are going to end up likely with that 5th seed. So now you have 2 playoff spots left. Now, you can see I put question mark Minnesota. I really like looking at this from the worst case scenario, in the sense of, man, if everything went wrong, how would we get in after this weekend? And you look at a team like, because that's how you have to figure out if you can clinch, I guess. If you look at a team like Minnesota at 7-6, it's kind of like what we're going to peek at here, and I'll actually throw it on the screen right now, in a specific scenario where the Lions could clinch the NFC North this weekend because of Minnesota's win. So even if Minnesota lost at Cincinnati, which looks like a very possible loss, we're still going to root for it. Even if they lost that game and we won, again, at best they could be 10-7, at worst we could be 10-7, and it would then come down to our head-to-head matchups because we play them twice. So it'd be different if we were playing like, Minnesota or something, but because we're not, we're playing, the Broncos, and they're playing Cincinnati, both AFC teams. They could still potentially pass us, because if they beat us twice on their way to running the table, then you get to a scenario where they could still win the division. So with that, it's not a spot where the Lions can actually clinch the division this weekend. Now, what can happen, and you could see here's how the Lions can clinch, the simplest terms: win 2 of your last 4. I mean, just keep it simple. You win 2 of your last 4, including beating Minnesota once, because then Minnesota can't get up to 11 wins because you had beat them. And then, of course, Green Bay can't catch up to 11 wins, even if they ran the table in a specific scenario. Now, here's a benefit for us. Those 2 teams play each other. So unless they tie, someone's going to beat somebody there. So as you can see on the bottom, right, Green Bay versus Minnesota. If Minnesota wins, if Minnesota beats Green Bay and the Lions win this weekend, Green Bay is now out of the race to win the division. However, if Green Bay wins and they knock down Minnesota, Minnesota is not technically out of the race for the division at 10-7, because they still play us twice, and they still could get the head-to-head tiebreaker if they won every game. Now, again, if they lose to us once, then you're in a spot where, yeah, we'd pass them, because then the record wouldn't be able to catch up to us. It's also not a situation where the Lions can just win 1 game over Minnesota and win the division. It almost gets you there, but that would not be the case, because division record-wise, if their only loss came to us once within their last 4 games, but they beat Green Bay, and then they beat us the second time around or the first time around, all of a sudden they're already 2-1 in the division, so they would end up with 4 wins in the division. We'd be 3-3 in the division, so they would actually pass us into that scenario. So there isn't a scenario to actually just win the division this weekend, but if you do handle business and both those teams lose, Green Bay's out, then also, and that's a possibility, both those teams absolutely could lose. We're seeing how well Cincinnati's playing. If that happens, then you have a possibility of taking out Green Bay this weekend and being in a spot where you beat either Minnesota once, or Minnesota just loses one of their last 3. Maybe the Packers beat them trying to get a wild card spot, and then you win the division. But we can't clinch that this weekend from the way that I understand it from kind of going through it. However, back to clinching just a playoff berth, that's why I pointed out, because you look at a team like Minnesota, because they only have 6 losses, we can't get into a spot where, 1, we have a tiebreaker over them this weekend because we haven't played them yet, and number 2, we also can't get to a position where they have too many losses to catch us, because at worst they'd be 7-7. At best, again, they can still finish 10-7 against games over us, and again, if they beat us, of course, our record, would fall towards them. So with that, we can't necessarily pass or clinch past Minnesota this weekend. We can, however, do that with Green Bay, because if Green Bay loses to Tampa, now they're 6-8. They can't get to 10 wins. So if we win, all of a sudden they can't catch us record-wise. So now we've passed Green Bay. All the other teams, as we talked about, if we win, whether that's Atlanta, New Orleans, Tampa Bay, all those teams with 6-7 at 6-7, if they, no matter if they win or lose, if we win, because we have the tiebreaker head-to-head over all of them, it won't matter even if we finish with the same record. So really, the way that it kind of makes sense here is this would be the scenario. Green Bay loses to Tampa Bay, which drops them to 6-8. Rams lose to the Washington Commanders, probably unlikely, but they go to 6-8. Seattle loses to Philly, they go to 6-8. Lions win, they go to 10-4. Then in that spot, you'd pass all of those teams because they would not be able to catch you, all those teams on the screen. Then all of those other teams, you would have a head-to-head tiebreaker against, which I believe is the second tiebreaker outside of just your straight up record. It'd be the second tiebreaker for two different clubs. So for that, the Lions would end up being ahead of everybody, and then you go to a team like the Giants, and the Giants at 5-8, they can't get to 10 wins currently. So they're already in a spot where if you win, no matter what they do, they can't catch you record wise. So the Lions, if my math is correct, they can clinch a playoff spot this weekend, because at very worst, they'd end up maybe the 7th seed. Minnesota, we can't pass them, but because there's 2 wildcard spots, at worst, we could end up the 7th seed. One scenario that I was very curious when I was looking at this is 2 scenarios, really. It was a crazy situation where for some reason, if San Fran lost out and then all of a sudden the LA Rams won the division, could San Fran keep us out of the playoffs? No, because San Francisco would then essentially just jump into the 6th seed. Minnesota would then shoot into winning the division because they'd have the 2 wins over us in a scenario where they won out, and all of a sudden we win this weekend, but then we lose the next 3, they'd win the division. So we'd still be in a wild card spot, but that would take them out of the wild card spot, which would open up a spot for us to actually settle back into. The other crazy scenario would be a situation where either Dallas or Philly, lost out for whatever reason, and that kept us out of the playoffs. But that would not be the case. Number one reason is because for this to actually happen this weekend is you would need Seattle to lose, and Seattle would then be losing to the Philadelphia Eagles, which means Philadelphia would not win out. So it would not lose out. So just keep it that simple. But plus, we're already accounting for both those teams being in the playoffs here, 1 at 5, 1 winning the division. So that's also not something that would keep us out. So again, I could be missing something, but looking at this, I don't believe there's anything we're missing here. I think that's the scenario. These things happen, and the Lions could actually clinch a playoff berth, and at very worst, make a wild card this season. This weekend, they could clinch a playoff berth, I believe, with a win, a Green Bay loss, a Rams loss, and a Seattle loss. Or, just to keep it simple, just win 2 games anywhere. With that being said, I think that's how the Lions can clinch a playoff spot this weekend. Again, I believe this is correct. If I missed some, I apologize. Put it in the comments, man. Let me know. But I think this is right. I kind of went through it here. And yeah, so there is a scenario this weekend. It's probably unlikely because I don't think the Rams are going to lose to Washington. But if it happened, and for whatever reason they played a bad game, I think the other 2 are possible. The issue is that all of those 3 teams are home. So that's the only thing working against there is Green Bay, LA, and Seattle are all at home this weekend. It's really unlikely to see every team lose at home in one weekend. But, maybe it's possible. There is a scenario. So I'll leave it right there. We can revisit this going forward. Thank you, Bob, for watching, and I'm out.